So here we are in our third JetPig service, addressing the second of those values, equity. I don't know about you, but when the old 7 principles were replaced in 24 by our current UU values and covenant, I was among those who felt some sense of loss as the familiar language of the older principles was displaced. It was helpful seeing Rev Tovis and Jonathan address this in the January service. Yet it did take some conscious effort to not roll my eyes when JetPig was revealed as the mnemonic to help us remember these 6 new values. A pig with a jetpack, that's our new mascot. I'll get back to that. So for this week, I've been meditating on the second of the JetPig values, equity. Why would we want or need to distinguish equity from the first value, justice? How could equity, as a framing concept and value, be part of what I've been living into, both professionally and personally? What would it help me uncover? Many of you already know that I'm an anthropologist who specializes in studying the role of language in what makes humans the peculiar kind of creatures that we are, individually and especially collectively. As a professor of this discipline, I have taught for decades about the history and methods of anthropology and linguistics, where and how such studies started, who influenced the emerging and developing fields and subfields, and how our theories and methods have transformed over time. However, I began to realize over the years that there's a dark and icky side to that history. I needed to address not just the problems of anthropology, that is, whatever and whoever it's been that we've been studying along the way, but also the problems with anthropology. How and when anthropologists got it wrong or contributed to misrepresentations and misunderstandings about humans, mistakes that have had some serious and lasting consequences. These consequences have, at times, contributed to structural inequities, and those structural inequities have led to the experienced inequities that have diminished so many human lives, and still do. So let's bring this down to some specific examples. Among the black eyes my chosen discipline has earned was how, especially in its earlier days of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, anthropology contributed to ideas that created and reinforced racist and Eurocentric science about the nature of human species. Physical anthropologists came up with metrics that were, at times, associated with more and less biologically advanced variants of humans, conveniently describing and attributing to the whiter European heritages the more highly evolved and sophisticated traits that were then used to explain their dominant and dominating position relative to other humans. These measurements included the sizes of the brain cases in the skull and the shapes and colors of our faces and our bodies. Some even argued that some of those races were not quite fully evolved as humans. Likewise, sociocultural anthropologists began to describe societies in technical terms of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, based on their social organization, technologies, and eventually the adoption of writing. Those studying linguistics tended to attribute more advanced stages of language with the structures seen in the written languages of the Europeans, and often describing the other exotic languages by how they differed from the European languages, frequently by highlighting what they didn't have when compared to those European languages, rather than some of the amazing features they did have that were absent in those familiar European languages. Okay, stay with me. I am working my way back to our UU values, equity, and flying pigs. In hindsight, it's become easier to see just how misguided some of those early misunderstandings were. But at the time, the sciences of anthropology, biology, and linguistics did have influence, and they were used to justify the concentration of power and wealth in the dominating elites in the European and US social and economic hierarchies. This is probably most explicitly and extensively demonstrated in the institutions of slavery that exploited labor and extracted wealth in ways with implications that still continue today. Who were able to become rich? How did their wealth come down to their descendants or to those they deemed worthy of receiving the gains of their capitalist concentration of wealth? And in Europe, these notions of racial superiority were at the heart of ideologies that gave rise to Nazism and genocide, something we did here in the States too. Whether in Europe or in colonial domains, patterns that we recognize reoccurring around us now. We've rightly fought against such atrocities by invoking justice as a right for all, not just a privilege for the few. It seems to me that the equity aspect comes in with the compounding of injustices over time. You remember that compounding interest we were taught when we were learning the value of saving money, whether to eventually buy something big like a house or save for retirement? Right? How developing habits of constantly adding little bits of savings over time can turn into very large, almost unimaginable sums of money. Well, the same goes for injustices and inequities. Injustices compound over time, including the racial, what we now see as racist, injustices that my disciplines have contributed, alas. And yet, I find hope, and there has been real change, both within anthropology and with what anthropology has brought to our societies in more recent decades. Careful reflection and the principles of both science and ethics cultivated in the studies by anthropologists and linguists have allowed us to eventually see the naive or ideological bases and assumptions in which they were entangled. The more data we collect about humans and their behavior as individuals and, as I was saying, collectively, and the more reliably we collect valid accounts, the more the true diversity and potential of human beings has become apparent. If we remain humble enough to do this carefully and ethically, our work becomes increasingly liberating and, frankly, exciting and rewarding. When anthropology, or more precisely, when anthropologists began to include and recognize women and then practitioners coming from the various societies or groups being studied, the questions and explanations became far richer, more diverse, and more valid, or we could say more truthful. Our theories have changed. Our methods have changed. Who has access to our discipline, its findings, and its resources has changed. As an increasingly just way of conducting an evaluation anthropology is adopted, the equity in the discipline is shared. And increasingly, we see anthropological findings used to support and validate our ways of dealing with and including those previously subjugated and disenfranchised. When justice compounds, structural equity increases, and individuals and groups increasingly experience those changes in their daily lives. And that's what's kept me doing anthropology all these years. So one last point. That jet pig thing, that flying pork with wings and a jetpack, I told you I'd come back to it, right? While seemingly so absurd at first, the linguist in me appreciates the power of clever language in practice. How could anything else so easily help me keep in mind the 6 ways we name our intertwined values, powering the vision of Unitarian Universalism? Justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. I now fully embrace the joy of our jet pig of love.